Welcome to the Carl Jackson Show podcast. This is your daily dose of objective truth in a world of confusion and lies. Guys, today I want to talk to you about Title IX and why the new Title IX rule that was handed down by the Biden administration is even worse than you might think. I'm joined by my guest, Sarah Parshall Perry of the Heritage Foundation. She's here to talk to me or talk with us about this. I read a column of hers on Heritage's website. The Department of Education's new Title IX rule, just as bad as expected. I got to tell you, Sarah, I think it's even worse. This is absolutely insane. If you don't mind, I'd just like to go point by point in your article. Sure. One of the things that you said, obviously, this is a 50-year-old civil rights law, but Title IX is a single sentence. And the reason why, and I'd love to get your take on this, I'm like, the reason why it only needed to be a single sentence is because most Americans have had common sense then that seems to be lacking today in American culture.
Yeah, Title IX was basically the crowning achievement of the women's liberation movement, right? So they were unsuccessful in passing the Equal Rights Amendment, but they were successful with Title IX. And I remember sort of hearing discussions about how much conservatives at the time fought against it, in large part because the athletic commingling they thought was going to be problematic for American education. But in those 52 years, we have seen incredible advances for women, right? So we've seen women get into graduate programs. We've seen women go into medical school, law school, into master's programs, go into scholastic athletics. But it's not just a sports rule. Many people think that this is just related to, for example, NCAA athletics, and it's only related to sports and higher education. But it was really, as you said, Carl, a single sentence. And all it does is prohibit sex discrimination in any federally funded education program. Now, let me clarify that that is just about every school in the country. And here's why. Because if you accept so much as $1 of federal funding, directly or indirectly, you could be a preschool program, trade school, vocational school, graduate program, any educational program that takes $1. You could take a young man on a reduced lunch program or a young woman on a Pell Grant. That's federal funding. So this applies to a lot more than I think people do. And so this administration, and the biggest change is that they've changed the term sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Well, that takes women's equality and turns it completely upside down, because we know, Carl, sex is not gender identity. You cannot change your biological sex simply because you identify as being another sex on any given day. That's really going to catastrophically impact American education.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, if I could circle back to something you said, Sarah, again, I'm speaking to my guest, Sarah Parshall Perry. You can find her on X at Sarah P. Perry. That is at Sarah, the letter P, and Perry on X. And check out her work at the Heritage Foundation. You can just look her up and you'll be able to find everything that she's written there. But if I could circle back here, Sarah, I got to tell you, years ago, I was on the board of my church, and we have a private school as well. And I can tell you, my pastor has since not quite retired, but he stepped down, and someone else is the senior pastor now. But I can recall being on the board when a very conservative guy, Christian, so on, et cetera. But at one point, because he did have a heart for young kids in troubled situations, poor families, so on, et cetera. At one point in time, he decided to allow the school lunch program, federal school lunch program, inside of our private school on the campus. And honestly, I railed against it in the board meetings because I was really into politics at the time, doing local radio at the time. And so I kind of understood what could happen. And I think it was within a year or two, they were like, okay, this is crazy. We've had enough, because the federal government can, just as you said, it was a few kids, but the federal government wanted to control so much based upon us accepting that lunch program, if you will, on behalf of those kids. It was insane.
Yeah. And you know what? It's not just the sexual orientation and gender identity expansion. There are a couple other poison pills in this rewrite. And it really is something that I think your listeners would do well to kind of pay attention to. Another thing that's included is pregnancy or related conditions. Now, here's why that's important. Among the other conditions, it includes termination of pregnancy. So, Carl, this is laying the foundation for abortion as a civil right in education. It would not surprise me if we see before too much longer abortion counseling and abortion services provided at federally funded education programs.
This is, and I got to tell you, Sarah, this is part of my frustration with these, with the left being able to use these bureaucracies, and then conservatives get into Washington, D.C., they get elected into office, and they always talk about reforming some of these institutions like the Department of Education, when I'm like, it's time to amputate some of these things, because these institutions, because they clearly work around the will of the people. You write here in the column how Biden is using Title IX to undermine, obviously, constitutional freedoms, the freedom of speech, and erase the very women that Title IX was enacted to protect. I want to talk about that a little bit, because, I mean, what you said was just jaw dropping, frankly. Um, but
Yeah.
but also at the same time, it is. I feel like Title IX in this issue, in my opinion, and the trans issue, I believe, that coincides with this issue that the left is using. They are gateways, just like this Title IX is a gateway for the federal government to encroach in all aspects of our lives, if you will, academia,
Yeah.
sports, so on, etc. The trans issue, all of these issues are gateway issues to fundamentally transform America and the way that Americans think, the way that, the way that Americans speak out. But you talk about the freedom of speech. Talk to us about how it affects specifically the freedom of speech. And I don't get this, Sarah. I want you to respond to this. How is it that the feminist movement, I actually heard Dana Lash say this, so I can't take credit for it, but I thought it was an excellent point. The feminist movement fought for Title IX,
Yeah.
and now they're fighting for men that want to be women, destroying women's sports.
Yeah. Carl, that's the $64,000 question, right? So
Yeah.
where are the feminists of old, the Betty Friedan's and the Bella Abzogs and the Gloria Steinems, the women who marched in Washington for the Equal Rights Amendment, for Title IX? Suddenly they just laid down and said, well, you know what? We don't want to be called transphobic. So we're just going to go ahead and let biological men who are in drag come into our private spaces. And when I say this is a catastrophic reimagining of American education, I am talking girls' locker rooms, dorm rooms, restrooms, overnight housing accommodations, sports teams. We are talking about every program that has been established for women so that we knew that women were guaranteed equality under this law, now being opened up to anybody who identifies as a woman. And the trans issue also has maneuvered its way through this rewrite into constitutional prohibitions, right? So now we're going to see, and I was on a stakeholder call with Catherine Lehman, who's the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, last Friday when this rule dropped. And let me tell you, they knew what they were doing. It dropped 5 a.m. on a Friday, of course, all 1,500 pages of it. And she was asked a direct question. If you misgender a student or a professor, are you subject to a Title IX harassment complaint? And she said, yes, in some instances, that will be the case. Well, I think the Supreme Court has had quite a bit to say about not only the ability to communicate what you want, but your ability not to be forced to communicate a message that you don't want. And that's exactly what's happening with this rule.
Man, it's such a great point. Sex stereotypes, sex related characteristics. This is so sickening to me too. We only have about a minute and a half left in this segment, and Sarah has agreed to stay with us for one more block to do another segment. But this will go all the way down to kindergarten and or pre-K, where little boys, little girls can go into the same restrooms, see each other's body parts, and become sexualized at a very young age. I mean, this is straight up perverted. I don't understand why there isn't more backlash to
Yeah,
this.
I don't either. And I think it's really incumbent upon conservatives and Christians to stand up and say, listen, if we don't toe the line on immutable truth, biological reality, how we are created, understanding divine design, we are going to lose so much ground going forward. I'll tell you a scary story. In Canada, just 2 weeks ago, the first surgery was performed on an individual who has now what's called bodily integrity dysphoria. He
Yes.
believes he's handicapped. They've just cut off 2 of his fingers. There's no self-limiting principle here. It just continues.
Okay, I mean that is absolutely insane, and I've actually done a show on that before. But the fact that you have doctors and professionals that
Yeah.
would allow that to occur, I mean, these people are sick. These people are twisted. That, that is so scary, and it is coming to the United States of America. There's no doubt
Yeah.
about it. We're seeing that again, guys. I am speaking to my guest, Sarah Parshall Perry. You can find her at the Heritage Foundation at heritage.org, Daily Signal, or find her on X at Sarah P. Perry. We'll have more on this when we get back from the break. You guys stay tuned.